You want me to do these, one of these tests? How's that? Hello, everyone. Hello, hello. Please grab a seat if you can. So a couple of housekeeping items, if I could. One is this nice TV you see standing in front of us here, the Toshiba 4K. That will be given out at our next section meeting. We brought it in here today just to tease you. It's actually going to be an incentive for you to come to our next section meeting. If we had achieved over 50 people, we'd give it away tonight, but looks like we're a little short of that. I'm only kidding, but we are going to give it out at our next section meeting, and I think that's very important. That TV is courtesy of Utah Scientific. We thank them for all they've done. They were giving that to us as they were walking out the door at our holiday event. And it was like, oh my God, that's right, we were going to give a TV away. Can you give it away at your next section meeting? And we said we would do something. So we'll do a no-cost raffle at our next meeting. So all of those that attend will get an opportunity to get a raffle ticket and participate in this drawing for this nice LED 4K TV. So that's part of that. A couple of other quick things. One is the success of our end-of-year holiday event, section meeting / technology fair was so overwhelming, both for us as a section, from a financial side, to be a positive thing for us. We didn't have to spend any money out of National's pocket, which was very, very impressive, and always has been from the beginning. In the 5 years running, we've been self-sufficient, which is a great testimony to all of you here. But you need to just put on your calendars. You'll certainly get a reminder fairly soon to let you know that we have reserved currently the same location. We're going to do things a little different. We're going to make the major ballroom area completely opened up, at least our thought process was, and have the exhibits kind of go around in a U or maybe even a G type format, have all of that present, and have the main thrust of the meetings inside there, and then have our dinner over in that other ballroom area that you participated in the lunch with. And that way it takes that away from the picture, and the exhibitors, manufacturers, vendors, suppliers, distributors, et cetera, will get the opportunity all day long of being able to work with people, number one. Number two, which is the important thing, we're going to make sure that during the cocktail times or break times that we open that up so that people can schmooze with the manufacturers and the vendors and distributors so that you can get your just due. We did better this year in doing that, but we want to do even better, so it's a more incentivized reason for you to participate, which is very important. So if you have any suggestions on that to make that better for yourselves, please feel free to email me. And last but not least, a couple of quick things. From the election side, I know I've been banging your heads on this since our last technology meeting in December, asking you to give us information. We have a slate ready to submit. That slate is going to be very effective. We have Brian Sluzar stepping down, which is great, which kind of opens some things up, and we have some new managers that's going to look at getting on this board and being part of all of this, which is wonderful. I know I've threatened to not be back. However, this is, without question, will be my last year of participation because, meaning 1920, or whatever it happens to be, because first of all, the board pleaded with me to please do this. And you know, I can't refuse Joe because he's a great guy, and Ed and Frank, but yes, you did, thank you. And that's wonderful. So I want to make sure that when I leave this section and sail off into retirement, which I'm already in, that I leave it in a great condition, and this section is as prosperous as it will be then, as it is today. And I say prosperous, I mean membership-wide, et cetera, et cetera. We're adding a membership chair this year, which is fantastic, and that's going to help drive our numbers. So it's all exciting. And one last thing on a personal side, because as I'm drifting off to Never Neverland, people are asking me, so what are you doing now? Are you busy? So I'm going to take the time and tell you what I'm doing. How about that? So I'm a musician and have been a musician all my life. I'm a drummer. I stopped playing for a couple of decades, But I'm back again, and I'm back in real great and strong time. As a matter of fact, my group has been invited to play at the 50th anniversary of Woodstock. We're playing with Mike Panera. Mike Panera is the former lead guitarist of Iron Butterfly, Blues Image, and Alice Cooper. Great artist, and he's playing in a concert with us in September, and you can't come, but that's too bad. But anyways, it's a great event. I'm just letting you know I am busy, number one. Number two, I'm on the board of TIAC. I'm on the technology board, and I'm on their voting board, as well as I'm the chair of their technology committee, and I'm the president of the musicians group. So between all of that and SMPTE, I'm busier now in my afterlife, if you want to call it, than I was in my real life. So don't worry about me, I'm doing well. And in this coming year, it will be 3 years that I'll officially be out of the industry. And that's why it's time, after this next period, to kind of move on and let the youngins, the utes, get into this environment and start to move on. So anyways, that being said, I want to thank IBM for stepping forward and being part of this tonight, because this is absolutely great. The artificial intelligence side, the machine learning side, and all of that tying into broadcast and content creation is really important. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the individuals that are here tonight from IBM, if you didn't read it already. Joe DiGiovanni. Joe is their account executive. Joe's a meteorologist and a corporate accountant. Joe, is it going to rain tomorrow? Joe, I need to know that. It's important. So I'm going to be outside. Okay, thank you. Joe has over 30 years of experience as a broadcaster, and he's been advising media and entertainment clients on leveraging their video and other applications and tools and work for many, many years. He has deep industry knowledge in this whole area. Now, Tom, our paths have crossed a number of times. And I just found out today, for the first time, Tom actually lives where I lived since the beginning of my youth, which was back in Rhode Island. So that's a wonderful place to be. I haven't been there in a while, but Tom has been in this business and in the industry. You might recognize his name from in the old days at Avid. Tom kind of originated when you were 19 years old and you got in this industry, or something like that. You were just like a little puppy, if I'm not mistaken, yes. So when he entered this industry back as a little puppy, he was one of the first few and prestigious individuals to get the FCC First Class Gold Award, or Gold Certificate, which is an incredible achievement and challenge by itself. But he was instrumental in the development of Avid's first media composer that we all, yeah. It was a great product, Tom, absolutely. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. Tom was obviously involved with Signet. He was involved with many other companies, involved in a lot of the IP applications and terrestrial type of engineering. And we're just glad that he's part of IBM, and IBM is coming on like a lion in the broadcast industry and applications today. And so we're excited about that, and we're excited that you could be part of all this. So without any further ado, let me turn this meeting over to, I assume, Tom and Joe. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having us. Food was great, by the way, so that was a good choice. Whoever made the choice on that, the burnt ends were really good. Nicely done, Ken, thank you. So just one comment on the bios. You know, it says I have deep knowledge, but when you compare what my knowledge is to Tom, depth is relative. So, you know, my knowledge may be deep, but Tom's is, you know, much more in this industry. So we're going to talk a bit about AI and cognitive and how that is making its way into the broadcast world. Before we dive in, do you want to have a little preamble as well?
I suppose. Well, again, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for having us. We know how busy you are. We know the time that you take away from your families and your homes and all the other work that you have to do. And it's something that, you know, we truly appreciate. You know, I think for Joe and for me, you know, our careers have been part of the broadcast, media, entertainment, content creation, service provider industries. We've built careers based on that. You know, we happen to work, you know, at IBM, and hopefully you'll find some of the information, you know, interesting and thought-provoking. But it's really our pleasure to be here, and thank you for having us.
So now we'll jump in. So when you start looking at AI, machine learning, you know, here's a couple places to start. You know, can AI and ML produce content that, you know, up to this point required humans to produce all this content? Can you get creative decisions that can, an intelligent system can accomplish those tasks? You know, so how can we do things that go beyond human scale that we have to do currently? So when you start applying that into content creation, you have all these different places that you can go. So speech recognition, you know, we can do things like that with subtitling. You can do that in many languages. You can do that fairly accurately too. So we're seeing results across the industry in the 90 to 95% range of accuracy when you start looking at things like closed captioning. And for those of you on the broadcast side, that's a pretty library
on things, right? I think the thing to keep in mind is that this is a journey. Not all of this stuff is fully baked. It's a journey that's going to occur. You'll find that thing in place is you know, dislodged, and so I think that's important to keep in mind because, you know, many times, you know, and
wow, I guess I got an email.
I hope it was your agent.
I should have closed Outlook before we got into this.
You know, that's great. You know, and because, you know, many times what you find is that, you know, if you don't keep that in context, you can't sort of plan appropriately. And, you know, Joe and I were talking about this earlier in terms of, you know, being prepared for what's coming by being able to really understand the technology and being able to really plan appropriately. I mean, it's very, very difficult from my perspective, I think, you know, and I think, Joe, you share this, to actually be in your shoes, because you're in an industry, you know, as Ken was saying, I worked the 4 p.m. to 4 a.m. shift in a television station. I was 19 years old. I was going to school during the day. It was like great. It was like the most amazing thing because you got to touch every piece of equipment. Nobody was around, you know, and it was just a great education that, you know, a lot of kids don't get these days, right? But it's a very fragmented industry. And, you know, there are 3,000 vendors, right, that you all have to deal with. You might not be dealing with 3,000, but there are about 3,000 vendors. 85% of the vendors have less than 3 products. It's very, very fragmented. And so when you start to make these decisions based on, you know, well, what company should we be using for, you know, X, Y, and Z, it becomes a very difficult choice. And I think probably the biggest lesson that we I think came across as we started to put together this deck was to make sure that these categories of development were something that we could highlight, and then we could put a little bit more specificity into each of the categories. That's really sort of the nature of what we did.
Right. So here we were, you know, just a bunch of stats up here. When you guys can see all that and read that, I'm not going to add much color to that. You know, when you start looking at how things have really changed and how things are growing, you look at what was going on last year between YouTube and Facebook in terms of their video views and things like that. You know, but some of the big challenges as you start looking at it, you know, metadata tagging, categorization of all the content that we have. So what was a stat that I saw recently? 98% of the world's digital content has been created in the last 2 years. So you start thinking about all that, and it's just all these videos, things that our kids are on these phones, and they're creating little videos on there, but it goes beyond that. You know, so you have all these ways of, well, how do we categorize all this content that we have? Then you look at the historic TV model where you're broadcasting to thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, to then you start looking at some of these other audiences now where you're broadcasting to these little tiny audiences of a few thousand people or hundreds of people. And then you start getting into, well, how do we make content with fewer resources? We're not adding bodies in a lot of situations anymore. In fact, Tom and I were talking earlier about how we've kind of come full circle. Think back into the 70s with little transistor radios. You know, we had these little earphones that we put in. Then we graduated to Walkman. And then we got into the bigger headphones and all that. Our stereos at home had these huge speakers. Then we come back to today, and everything's been miniaturized again. After we got big, we got into big TVs. Now people want to watch things on their phone. You know, they want to have these little tiny headphones. We talked about having to pristine video back in the late 90s with analog. It's got to be pristine. Now we're taking video that's shot in our phones and we're putting it up in HD and it's going on in 60-inch TV, and this video looks like, you know, something that engineers told me back in the late 90s, I won't put that on TV, that's horrible quality. So, you know, things have changed in a lot of ways in what we do. So you start looking at the evolution of AI, and you go back to around 2010, you know, pretty narrow scope, you know, initial value creation was fairly low, and then you start getting to where we are now. We're just kind of in the beginnings of having a more broad perspective on it, and we're starting to see some disruption. You know, again, I mentioned closed captioning before. You look at the expense of paying human closed captioners, and then what you can do with AI, you know, you're in some cases able to cut that amount in half of what it would cost you. And then you start going beyond what's going to happen in the next 20 years, next 25 years, and 30 years, and then you're looking at some real revolutionary change in what can be done. And and that's something from an IBM perspective that IBM is obviously on the cutting edge of that. So this is kind of a neat slide here. So you kind of go back into the beginning portion of AI. You know, we're looking at, so it's descriptive. So what does that mean? Okay, it's what happened, is how we were kind of looking at things. And then you start getting into prescriptive. Okay, what happened and why did it happen? And then we're getting to the point, as you're getting into where we are now, we can kind of predict, you know, what's going to happen with everything. And then you start getting down to the end, you start getting into the cognitive space, and then it's like, how can we make it happen? You know, so we start talking about some of the other things like highlight clipping and things like that. So it's really kind of an interesting evolution as you go along there. Then you start looking at cognitive systems and, you know, how does it work with humans? And if you listen to some of the branding at IBM, it's not artificial intelligence, it's augmented intelligence. So it's to help you make decisions, it's to help you take better actions. So when you start looking at, okay, what are the things that humans are good at? And these are the things over here on the left. You know, common sense, morals, compassion, abstraction, things like that, generalization. Then you get into a cognitive system, and it's like, well, what are they good at? What do they excel at? How can we marry these things together? So locating knowledge, identifying
query. And so, you know, and I'm sure you'll head nod to this. You know, I remember being down, you know, we're a very large broadcaster, 300,000 hours of content in the library. They had digitized about 30,000 hours of it. And, you know, they probably had 15 to 20 people in cubicles looking at the video, file-based video, looking at the date, typing it in Google, looking for a newspaper, trying to identify the people in the video, adding that to the metadata and so forth. And, you know, just the sheer drudgery of it, right? And then having to crank through these types of things. And so, you know, part of this becomes, you know, everyone says, well, you know, can you help me unlock the archives? And really, I think, you know, there are pieces here, and Joe's going to talk about this on the next slide, when he starts to talk about sort of the different pieces, you know, and you can think of them as different widgets that, when chained together in a certain way, provide a workflow, and then if you put enough workflows together, you have a solution. And, you know, I'm particularly, you know, jazzed, if you would use that word, on the natural language understanding query aspect, because, you know, we've done some different things about this, and, you know, we've indexed quite a lot of certain types of content. And the simplicity of being able to ask a question as you would ask a normal question, instead of keywords plus keyword plus keyword, is really remarkable for the staff that is trying to wade their way through this content. And I think that the NLU piece is really something to keep in mind here. To me, it's a real game changer for you know, just the discovery process of content.
So as Tom talked about, you know, lots of different pieces. And so, you know, some of the building blocks that have been exposed as APIs, you know, you start looking at all the different things here that what you can do in terms of, and I keep going back to the thing that's kind of the hot button for us right now, is the text-to-speech. You start looking at that, you know, you're able to do things.
And you're talking to your peers, you're talking to manufacturers, we've got NAB coming up and so forth. These are some fundamental building blocks. I mean, if you think about this, you know, our employees are doing this right now. They're just doing it in different kinds of ways, right? They're watching, they're enriching the content, they're manually, you know, tagging, they're putting some form of, this video is about this. You know, but with that content deluge that's coming in, you know, we need systems to help us do that. You know, it's very akin to Facebook, you know, being, you know, chastised for putting things, you know, on Facebook Live with just the sheer amount of streams coming through that can't all be monitored. So what do? You know, there's this sort of reaction to, you know, to react to the public, you know, outcry, and they essentially employ 3,000 people, you know, to essentially be eyes and ears for content. Well, it's one, probably not sustainable. Two, it's an arbitrary number, right? And so you really need systems, you know, so that, you know, if you're looking at a, you know, if you're looking at a gesture, you know, does this mean somebody's, you know, pointing? Does it mean, you know, there's potentially, you know, a danger? Those are the types of things that systems, you know, can provide to you. And I think probably one of the most important things is that, you know, we all, you know, being in the industry so long, we've grown up with purpose-built units, right? Purpose-built boxes, which grew to, you know, servers, and then they grew to, you know, convergence, and then hyper-converged plays, and then VMs and so forth. And we're starting to see this whole sort of daisy chaining of components to do things. And, you know, as you go through your research and as you talk to people, you know, these will be the sort of the key building blocks. And then, you know, it'll be, does anyone have best of breed, or can we, or really, and Joe and I were talking about this earlier, interoperability. You know, you really should have some kind of architecture that you're being able to implement that has, you know, where you can, just like a Lego block set, put things in and pull things out, because, you know, everyone's in a race to do this. One of the things that was very interesting about those Avid years was that in and of itself, you know, this small, tiny company could not drive the computer industry, couldn't drive the storage industry, couldn't drive the, you know, the compute, you know, bus industry, certainly couldn't drive the network industry. And so what you have now is you have large companies, right? I mean, speech to text and sentiment analysis, you know, that comes out of call center technology, right? And so, you know, you're complaining about a bill and you're getting irate, and suddenly, you know, you've got a system that is helping to cull those calls, and then to then bring that up to a manager level. Well, it's the same type of thing. So, you know, we think these are really important components just to keep in mind as you build out these systems.
So as I talk to a lot of my clients out there, you know, it's what are we going to do with all this content that we have? Whether that's content that's in an archive, whether that's content that we're creating today on a daily basis. How can we take that content and make it more useful? How can we take that content, make it more searchable, more discoverable? So when you start looking at what's possible across the industry in terms of how we can apply AI to some of these things, speech to text, as Tom just talked about, is a big one. When you start getting into other things, you want to make your content, you want to tag it with metadata, you want to make it more searchable. So you start with the speech to text. From there, you can go on and do a bunch of other analysis within that. So you can do visual recognition as well. What's in there? You know, what are we looking at that's part of this, so that, again, we can tag that with metadata. Then you get into understanding natural language. So how can you take what's being said and then derive other concepts out of that? And then you start getting into tone analyzer, personality insights, so you can look at, you know, what's going on with emotion, things like that, the overall personalities of the people that are there. You can take all of this, and then you can put it all together, tag your content, and now you have things that you can get to that's usable, that you can use across different platforms, because now you can search it. Maybe I want to take something and I want to cut some video in a different way for a different platform. And these are all things that are going to help you do things like that. So anything else on this, Tom, you want to touch on? I think the next slide, I think, kind of encapsulates. You can take that now and you can say, okay, with that type of capability, what can we do across the entire industry? So these are a handful of things here. You know, we can help you on daily news events, personality insights. Again, we talked about the visual recognition. You start getting into other areas where you can take the content and how can we create things based on that, whether it's long form or short form content. We can do some interesting things that we've seen across the board with sports highlights. Or conversely, same thing in tennis, same thing at a golf tournament. So there's dozens of capabilities out there, different sports now, that you can see capabilities of cutting highlights in an automated fashion. you start getting into other things too, social live events and so on and so forth. But really the possibilities are pretty cool as you start looking at this as we go forward and the capabilities of AI matures over time. So what does that mean for TV? So TV is where I come from. I spent 10 years on air. We kind of alluded to that. Yes, I played a weather guy on TV for 10 years. I've sold weather equipment to many of you in this room over the years. And now with IBM, we've merged the weather side with Watson Media. So I've been able to take those years of talking to engineers and understanding video at about this level, and I've expanded it to about this level. But so what does it mean for TV? So, you know, these are the things that can be done in AI today, you know, on the left side here. Content recommendations is another cool one. So kind of like YouTube-esque, where you're on YouTube and you're watching a video and you're done with that, it serves up the next one to you. So there's capabilities out there, same thing for a TV station. Someone's on your site, somebody is looking at your news content, they've watched a story, and hey, now we've served up the next one. And by the time you've come to this site enough, it gets to know you and it starts serving you up content based on what you've watched before and what you've liked before. So same thing when you're kind of watching on your cable provider as well. So those are all the things that can be done today. You start looking at, well, what's next? And so then you start looking at program schedules, formats, things like that. The big thing, I think, will come in.
You know, and as I said, you know, as we said earlier, you know, when you start to look at how to diagnose a patient in a healthcare situation, the more data you have, the more examples you have, the more things that have become part of that data set, the more better informed a decision with a confidence rating that increases systems. So with those types of things, we can move forward a little bit. If we assume and we train systems to look for certain things, over time they will start to distinguish what these things are, right? So you might not know at the beginning, but as you start to load in lots of data, systems suddenly, you know, become aware that it's a traffic light, right? And you can do this very, 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 very quickly. And you know, this is applicable to many, many types of things. You'll see it as people start to talk to you. Well, we'll be applying some speech to text, some image recognition, you know, and then Joe talked a lot about, you know, automated sports highlights, right? And so again, with that sheer number of content that's coming in, we just don't have the staffs that we used to have to be able to create all these clips in a very short amount of time. I mean, why was at-home productions, why did that even occur, right? It occurred because, again, couldn't necessarily send all the people out, couldn't necessarily create all the OB vans. We saw those budgets coming down. And then, you know, it's that time to market and time to the viewer, which ultimately, and, you know, the rise of the open internet, right? And so that's why you have, you know, companies that, you know, utilize that open internet, you know, will handle latency, handle a packet loss, and, you know, suddenly, you know, we're able to do things that we haven't done before with growing files that you're editing and clipping along. You know, it's not that long ago that we didn't even have that. It's probably, you know, at most 2 Olympic cycles, if that. So it's moving pretty rapidly. And so that, you know, once you can start to do this first piece, the easing human workloads, you know, then you can start to get this content insight, this workflow steering, and then where it gets really kind of interesting is this sort of automatic content creation. It gives people some of the heebie-jeebies, actually. You know, they think, well, wait a minute, you know, we've got a system that's doing this. But it is something to start preparing for. One of the things that we thought was very, very important is the words that we used in phase 1, the easing human workloads. Many, many times people will say, okay, well, we're gonna cut the human out of this and we're gonna lose staff. You know, I've never felt that that actually came to fruition. You know, when we look at the Avid experience or when we look at the Signian experience, all of those people, you know, learn something else in their career. And for example, you know, it was a fait accompli that once, you know, tape-to-tape machine editing was going to go by the wayside and you were going to have, you know, a ingest system that would digitize and then ultimately, you know, there would be editors. What happened to that assistant editor? Well, that assistant editor didn't go away. Actually, the job got even more important. It became a data wrangler. Remember that, right? All of a sudden, all of this data was created. MAM started to come in, and then suddenly you had this explosion of digital files, and many assistant editors moved from the I'm loading tape to I'm managing the data. And so I think that there's a very important notion here and a very important reality that, yes, the systems are going to change, the roles are going to change, but there's all of these new things. And we see this clearly in the IP fabric. The IP fabric, implementation, you look at all the CCIEs, the CCNAs, you look at all of these folks, and, this awareness of how things are going to, how you'll be retrained, how you'll have to learn some new things, but, you're in this amazing world of what IP can deliver. So this is how we're going to take you through the rest of the presentation. All right, so on the easing human workloads piece, you all know this, but here are some of the components, right? We're starting to see this phonetics to text piece coming in, the ASR coming in, and we're also a journey here, right? Because you all know this part very well. Joe knows this better than I in terms of the journey that closed captioning is on, et cetera, et cetera. These are learning systems, right? And so you'll start to, you ask the inevitable questions. Speaker change identification, punctuation, how are you measuring accuracy, right? And if you go from organization to organization, these are all different definitions. And yet you have to get, the status quo plus in order to even introduce, these cognitive systems into the mix. And that's why, it's a journey. But this is just one example of where you'll first start to see this. Now, what's interesting here is deep images, pixel dropouts, and so forth. And a human would have to watch about 200 unique compositions to do that. So it kind of gives you some scale of why we need systems to help ease that human piece of it. We're all running, you're all running quality control applications, software based applications, and so forth. But it's that scale problem again. So, if phase one is designed to automate some of these processes, now we're going to get to sort of what insight can we gain from applying some of these widgets, if you will, some of these applications, some of these libraries to the content? What kind of value can we extract from it? And then ultimately, what insight can we get from the content? And how can we steer that into a particular workflow? So it's interesting, right? Because machines can detect things that I certainly can't detect, Joe. And so we have waveforms. And it's interesting because different sports have kind of a pattern. And it's interesting when you actually look at it. And this happens to be a tennis match. And so they're very, very repeatable. Now, it makes common sense, right? I mean, a volley, right, it's kind of repeatable. Bang, pop, pop, pop. A tennis ace, and then you're listening, right? You have these cheers. And you're starting to make these informed judgments after you've taught this potentially brilliant child of what to look for, right? And so you could potentially say, if you see this thing that looks like a tennis volley and it's followed by this thing that, looks like cheers, and you can correlate it with some visual analysis of a player doing some kind of gestural, move that we equate to as a, something good, well, maybe you mark it and you say that might be, a worthwhile highlight. And you might get it right, you might get it wrong, you might get close. And as you train more and more, you'll get better and better, right? And so, it's interesting because really, this is audio analysis, right? And providing some form of judgment around what that actually means, correlating it with some player information, data, facial, potentially, gestural, potentially. You know, lots of manufacturers have these little libraries. It's how you put them together to actually have this sort of, oh, I'm gaining some insight from this content now. And so this is just yet one simple example of what becomes possible. Now this is kind of interesting, and that is, you know, as I said earlier, it's a combination of things. So if you can take some real-time data that's coming off, you know, real statistical integration. You know, Joe talked earlier about, you know, World Cup. Well, World Cup was kind of an interesting thing because it became a very, very sticky, addictive application that Fox put out. But it was based on 50 years of library matches applied, and with some of these things applied to it, and essentially a presentation layer which enabled you to do what Joe said, and that is, you know, Messi and plays against this team and go curate for me. And, you know, 5 minutes of highlights, you know, and it was very interesting. Grammys was another interesting example where it's about relationships of these music stars and music artists, and where were they, what bands were they in, and, you know, it becomes almost this compilation of video, audio, data, statistics, and you're presented in a way that you can actually interact with, and I think make a presentation that's very, very comfortable for a viewer. And so if you combine all these tools from phase 1 and phase 2, you can think about, you know, as Joe was saying, you know, 50 categories per match, 20 matches per day, people. And what is being said? So in the sense, a machine is listening to the audio, okay? So we loaded in some keywords, but it actually auto-generated these keywords, what types of objects were recognized, and then by virtue of, okay, you're there. It here. Come up to so it generated these frames across the top, also time-stamped with these particular keywords that it picked up. And again, you teach the system, right? So it's a learning system. What objects were recognized? What can we derive? What were the top subjects that were talked about? And ultimately, you know, what kind of emotional score can we provide to it? And this again is something that, you know, is a system that learns in terms of you know, elevated voices, certain types of words. Potentially mean something that is, you know, anger, for example, versus joy. All right, Joe, we want to take everyone through the captioning piece.
Sure. So with captioning, you know, we touched on that a little bit earlier. You know, it's quite an interesting endeavor. So there's a few challenges when you look at live captioning in the industry today, aside from the cost. The other side is there's latency. So if you have breaking news, breaking weather, you have to cut in on a live broadcast. Your live captioner is not always ready. A lot of contracts say, we'll have somebody ready in 10 minutes. So if you think of a tornado on the ground and you have to go to air and you have to caption that, 10 minutes could be a big problem. So AI gives the ability to take captioning and go to air immediately. So it solves that, it speeds up your delivery time on top of the cost savings. As Tom had mentioned before, the capabilities for the AI rates of accuracy. Tom had alluded earlier, you know, you start getting into starting off with a very rudimentary speech to text. Okay, there's no punctuation in that. You're just looking for what was said. As the systems have progressed and as we've gone along, now you're starting to see punctuation put in there. You're starting to see things like speaker change, so you'll see carets in the caption when somebody else starts talking. And then, of course, you want to get into some.
Okay, so